Okay, so now we are going to look at the other side of the economy, the production side. And we're basically just going to set up the idea of the production function and to talk a little bit about the way in which individual firm behavior likely affects the supply side of the economy, and then ultimately, of course, ends up affecting the macroeconomy as a whole. But let's jump in. So the thing from our perspective is that, like we have done so far, is that we want to put everything into a readily understandable model. In the context of consumer decisions, that model is utility maximization subject to a budget constraint. In the context of the production side, we can think about things in terms of profits. And so that's sort of in the back of our minds throughout this entire conversation, is that the supply side of the economy is ultimately going to be a function of the search for profits by individual firms. Now, we're going to set up, in a sense, a simpler idea of an economic system, and for now, effectively holding sort of production constant. In fact, the neoclassical model, which we're going to get to in tomorrow's lectures, assumes a completely vertical and therefore fixed level of production, whereas we would typically think that production is an upward sloping, non-vertical line. But regardless. So here's just some of the setup to the model that we're going to look at. It sort of, in a sense, is similar in terms of philosophy. So we're going to think about economic agents here optimizing. The difference now is that when we talk about the consumption side and the production side as optimizing, now this starts getting us closer to that idea of equilibrium. And that ends up being one of the more difficult conversations to have in a macroeconomic class, because you're in a sense trying to sort of think about these very complex markets that likely have very complex equilibrium processes in terms of those markets finding equilibrium, and then the differences, those nuances of how markets find equilibriums is of course going to go on and affect the benefits that those industries have on the economic system. So, we will, like we always have, generalize this to a representative firm, just like we did with consumption and the representative household. But there is, of course, a lot of nuance built in here. So we're going to model both the production and the investment decision from the firm's perspective. And then we're going to model the supply of labor as an endogenous factor of consumer, or I should say worker, utility maximization. Okay, so the firm. So the firm is in many ways is sort of the jumping off point to understanding the supply side of an economic system. So we can think about there being like an individual firm production function. Now, one thing I want to keep in mind here that's a little bit maybe confusing is the use of "in" here for labor. Now, very often, and you will see this in the some of the readings that I have you read. So I'm going to have you read stuff from Gregory Mankiw's textbook. And in Mankiw's textbook, he uses L like we typically would for labor. In the Guerin et al. Text, they use "in" for labor because ultimately, when they get to the solo growth model, which we're not going to get to the last week of this term, they relate it back to population growth. And so population and "in" are usually, the "in's" usually the letter you use for population. And so it relates back to sort of population. So I don't want you to get too confused. You can think about this as being rewritten as production in time period T, is equal to AT here can be thought of as just sort of a productivity, or I often think about it in terms of like technology. And so the more technologically progressed your production function is, it's going to have this additive benefit to your overall production function. And then that's going to be times the function itself, which is going to have a capital amount as well as a labor amount. And again, here LT is equal to NT, just so we can kind of keep things straight for ourselves. We assume that this productivity variable A is exogenous. Now, I haven't talked much about the differences between endogenous and exogenous variables, but that's going to become a very important point for us moving forward. When we say that AT is exogenous, what we mean is that it's determined outside of this particular model. There's no deterministic aspect to AT. AT, in a sense, sort of exists, and the firm has a particular constant level of AT. Now, the firm could, over time, perhaps make investments to try to increase AT, but that, of course, starts to kind of complicate the process. For now, we'll just assume that AT is exogenously determined. If we, on the other hand, said something was endogenously determined, what that would mean is that the outcome is determined by some sort of model, right? So there's no model to describe AT. AT's just given, right? If YT here, YT is endogenous, right? Because YT is a function of this other stuff. AT is not a function of anything in this particular model. Now, like we did with consumption, we very often turn to relatively simple forms of production function. You'll notice here that we have a Cobb-Douglas production function, which you'll notice is almost identical to the Cobb-Douglas consumption function, except, of course, instead of consumption, we're talking about production, and instead of the goods being consumed, we're talking about an amount of capital used in the production of a product and the amount of labor used in the production of a product. And of course, you'll notice that we have the exponents, which are ultimately, like they did in terms of utility theory, they're going to define the mix of capital and labor that the firms use. And so you can imagine that, if alpha is, high, so if alpha is large, then capital is going to be more important for a particular firm. And so this might be capital intense. We might call that capital intense. So for now, we're not really sort of worrying about like different types of firms sort of operating in different industries. We're just kind of thinking about an firm sort of operating in the economic system, and then we're going to sort of aggregate up the behavioral predictions to the macroeconomy. But it is useful to start thinking about different industries in terms of things like capital intensity or labor intensity. That's going to ultimately be a prominent conversation that we have with respect to trade. Because one of the determining factors of trade is going to be the relative dependence upon capital versus labor with respect to a particular country. And so we have sort of capital intense countries, like the US is a capital intense country. And then I say a country like Bangladesh is a labor intense country. And so if your economy is a labor intense economy, what that means is that the firms in your economy tend to be labor intensive firms. And if you are a capital intensive economy, that means the firms in your economy tend to be high capital intense firms. And so when we talk about trade flows, when we talk about imports and exports, of course, this is going to end up having a really large impact. And so you can, I think, simultaneously think about this being the firm production function, but then it's very, very easy for us to move from the firm production function to, the economy production function, as it were. Now, In the solo model, which we're going to talk about in the last week of the semester, capital accumulation ends up being kind of the name of the game, the big sort of talking point of that model. Capital accumulation is a byproduct of profit maximization of firms. So we're going to talk about capital accumulation again from the macroeconomic sense, and it's going to sound like we're thinking about capital accumulation in terms of country. So this country has this particular rate of capital accumulation, this other country has this other rate. Really, though, countries don't have capital accumulation, right? It's the firms in those countries are accumulating capital at a particular rate. And then again, the sort of general or maybe average level of capital accumulation can be thought of as sort of more broad in terms of the macroeconomy. And so we're going to make some assumptions about capital accumulation that end up being really important for the model as a whole. So basically, we're going to assume that the firm finances capital through paying of interest, essentially paying debt. Now, there are ultimately going to be, in the real world, multiple ways for firms to finance investment, or I should say finance capital investment. They can, issue bonds, they can issue stocks, or of course, they can just take out loans. So there's going to be some sort of conversation that we're going to eventually have about interest rates relative to stock yields and bond yields, and that ends up being a really important sort of conversation. So the ways in which the firms in your country are accumulating capital, the ways in which firms are financing their capital investments ends up being very important. So if we just go down to the bottom here and we look at this sort of capital accumulation line, or I'm sorry, capital accumulation function, the idea is that the capital that a firm would have in the second time period, T plus 1, is going to be equal to whatever investments they made in time period T, and then whatever of their existing capital stock depreciated out. Okay. Delta here represents depreciation. So capital depreciates, right? You buy a car. I want to spell depreciation. D-E, yeah, there we go. Sorry, I know the handwriting on the Zoom whiteboard is terrible, so I apologize. So depreciation. So the idea is that you buy capital, and then over time the value of that capital declines, the usefulness of that capital declines. That's what we refer to as depreciation. So this delta represents depreciation. You'll notice that if delta goes up, in other words, if the depreciation level that the firm faces rises, sort of all else equal, then that means more of their existing capital stock is going to be depreciated out. And then so if the idea is that the firm wants to maintain capital or even grow capital, then that's, of course, going to require them to make investments. And so the extent to which depreciation is related to investment ends up being a really important feature of kind of the firm optimization process. And again, will be something that we sort of bring back over time. So again, the idea here is that firms make investments in capital, and that the amount of capital accumulation that they experience is going to be a function of their level of investment. So how much are they investing in capital? And then how much of their existing capital stock gets depreciated out prior to the next time period. Now, in terms of the prices that are relevant to the firm, from our perspective here, only essentially we're going to think about sort of two prices. So you have the price of labor, which is going to be a wage rate. And then you're going to have the price of capital. Now, this sort of requires somewhat of a conversation. So when we talk about the price of capital, we use this term rental rate. The idea behind rental rate is that instead of calling it the price of capital, we call it the rental rate of capital, again, because of that depreciation. So you don't really own capital, you rent it, it depreciates, and then eventually you usually end up scrapping it. And so in that sense, I think it makes a lot of sense, I should say, in order for us to refer to the price of capital as the rental rate. And as we said before, firms are going to borrow to finance that investment. And then they pay an interest rate, which is that there are two sort of interest rates. There is the interest rate that is relevant to the firm. So the rate the firm pays for loans. And then there's the interest rate that is relevant to the household. And firms and households may very well face different interest rates. That's something that we should certainly consider. And then FT is just going to be a variable representing sort of friction. Basically, we can think about FT as the sort of ease with which money gets lent out. And so if friction goes up, if it's harder to get money out, then that's going to put upward pressure on the firm interest rate, as it were. So again, just to go back for a second, the firm invests in capital accumulation relative against their depreciating capital. In order to pay for that investment, they pay a finance charge in the form of an interest rate. And so this is where we start to get into the conversation about interest rates affecting firm decision making. The channel, the mechanism through which interest rates affect firm decision making is mostly through that investment conversation. So when we're talking about interest rate policy and how that affects firm decision in sort of developed economies, our belief is that interest rate policy mostly works its way through capital investment. So when we later on talk about the benefits and cons of particular types of interest rate policy, the way in which we're going to think about that kind of mechanism, that kind of causal effect, is that interest rates affect firm investment decision in capital. Now, the important point here, and something that we're going to talk about in the next lecture, is that investment decisions are going to broadly impact the economic system to the extent that investment decisions made by one firm may impact investment decisions by another firm. Typically, in these simpler models, we sort of assume away that possibility just so things are a little bit simpler to understand. But it's worth sort of keeping in the back of your mind. You hear me say that a lot, right? Keep this idea in the back of your mind. It's often that additional nuance that complicates the relatively simple models that we're talking about. All right. And then one of the things I like about this particular setup is that it takes on a fairly modern view of firms. And so here we say the firm has a dividend. The firm's dividend is simply what they produced, YT, minus what it cost them to pay their labor, essentially, right? And so the idea here is that households invest in firms and therefore, in a sense, publicly own them, right? And then so the value of the firm to those public owners is this sort of dividend. And the dividend is just output minus the cost of labor. Okay, this is one of the reasons why whenever there's a report that comes out that talks about wage increases, very often the stock market will decline on those days because the report comes out and says firms are having to pay people higher wages in order to retain them. And so that puts downward pressure on dividends. And if you put downward pressure on dividends, then do we expect there to be some sort of weakness in the stock market? So again, the idea here is that the firm, in a sense, is balancing their ability to maximize profits with respect to their need to invest in capital and hire labor. Again, that sort of classic kind of economic condition. So we can take the equations that we've talked about thus far, and we can sort of combine them into what we refer to as the future dividend. And that future dividend has what we refer to as a terminal condition. The terminal condition basically means that we want no capital accumulation after the first time period or after the second time period. So T and then T plus 1. And T plus 2, we want capital accumulation to, or I should say capital to be 0. We want the capital stock to decline to 0. Okay. Now, capital is one of those interesting things, and you're going to hear us talk about this sort of concept a lot. There is the capital stock, and then there is the capital accumulation. Capital accumulation is a flow of capital against the sort of existing capital stock. Okay. And so the idea here is going to be that the dividend of a firm next time period, so dt plus 1, is equal to the output of that next time period plus whatever capital is left over after depreciation minus labor costs and then minus finance cost. Okay. So again, we have output here. We have capital. We have labor cost. And we have finance cost. So you can now see, what does the interest rate do to the dividend? What does labor do to the dividend? What does capital accumulation do to the dividend? And so this just sort of makes a relatively easy a model in which, from the firm's perspective, again, we can see that sort of profit maximizing balance, right? Very often when students take economics, their sort of assumption they make about profit maximization is that the goal is to simply produce as much as possible. But in fact, what firms do is they produce up to the optimal point. And the idea here is that whatever is optimal for the firm is going to be, well, first off, it's in a sense going to be sort of related to what the firm is maximizing, profits versus dividend. And then we can even bring in interesting conversations about maximizing shareholder value. And again, that's that stuff you want to keep in the back of your mind, that sort of complicates things, but is useful for us to have interesting conversations. Then the firm valuation, as we were saying, as I was mentioning before, is just going to be equal to the present discounted flow of dividends, right? So when we talk about the valuation of a firm, the economic idea is that you're going to experience a dividend in time period T. You're going to experience a dividend in the second time period, T plus 1. The value of the firm in time period T is the present value of those flows of dividend. And again, remember here that the relevant interest rate for discounting future profit is that RT, not RI. So this is the capital finance interest rate, but we do not discount future flows of money by finance charges. We discount future flows of money by consumer interest rates. All right, so then this sets up a relatively simple firm problem. The firm wants to maximize their value. And then we just have three seemingly complicated but pretty straightforward constraints. The first constraint is that the capital in time period T plus 1 is equal to investment plus the depreciation of the capital stock from the previous period. I should say the 1 minus the depreciation. The dividend, which you'll notice again, we said the dividend is just the production, the output minus labor costs. And then we have that terminal condition for future dividends. So these are our three, in a sense, constraints that the firm must satisfy when they try to maximize their value. And you'll notice here that how the firm maximizes their value is they pick an amount of labor to hire, to employ, and they pick an amount of investment to make. Okay, so that's a little bit odd because we would typically think that a firm maximizes profits by picking a labor to employ and in capital to be used in production. But here, because we want these models to have a more contemporary kind of modern feel, and because capital purchases require financing, we're going to think about the optimal conditions being set not by capital, but instead by investment. And so that's where now the thing like depreciation matters. Depreciation affects profit maximization, sort of so on and so forth. And again, also sort of keep in mind that If every firm is doing this, if every firm is maximizing the value over sort of multiple periods, then the net result of this, the way that we're going to think about the macroeconomy, is that it is an aggregation of these decisions, right? So this is going to constitute the supply side, right? The amount that is produced when the firm tries to maximize their value is going to be what the economy gets in terms of supply. Just like when consumers maximize their utility by consuming particular goods, that's where the economy gets its consumption from. So on both sides, we have profit maximization from firms, we have utility maximization for consumers, and the net result of this is going to be an equilibrium condition in our macroeconomy. So we just go through. I'm not going to really go through the math too much here because it's not as useful. And really, we're just kind of working towards this sort of neoclassical model. But suffice it to say that we get a very classic result in terms of the sort of first order conditions, which is that essentially the marginal benefits are equal to marginal cost in equilibrium. What I mean by this is, for example, when we ask how many employees does the firm want to hire, employing additional employees is going to cost me in terms of wages. So that's the cost of hiring additional people. And then when I hire those additional people, they're going to generate increases in my productive ability. And that's where the benefit comes from. And so when we talk about the firm basically producing up to the point where marginal benefit equals marginal cost, that is true both in terms of how much labor they employ. So basically, you're going to hire individuals up until the point when the cost of doing so just equals the benefit of doing so. So the marginal cost, that is the additional wage paid to a new employee, compared to the addition to my production function from hiring that individual. I will not, in a sense, hire someone who costs me more than they will add to my production function. So we have a decision rule that basically says that the marginal cost I'm willing to pay for something like labor is going to be equal to the productive benefit I get from hiring that additional unit of labor. And so here, this is an important point down here that we're going to come back to a lot during the semester, and that is that the rental rate of capital is very much related to the real interest rate. In fact, in some economic models, the rental rate is simply assumed to be the real interest rate. And so this very much ends up being kind of one of the interesting characteristics of the sort of classical view, is that ultimately the interest rates that households pay end up being very similar to the interest rates that firms pay for capital, because ultimately they are buying the capital so as to maximize profits. Consumers are supporting firms through, again, stock, bond, debt, essentially, right? I mean, the end result of all this is going to be that firms have access to financial capital to take out loans to invest in capital because consumers do not spend all of their money. That's essentially what ends up happening here. So what governs how much money people save? Go back to the dynamic savings model, right? Interest rates. So if interest rates affect how much people save, then it makes a lot of sense that those interest rates are going to end up being close related to the financing charge that firms pay when they actually borrow money to invest in capital. Right. You'll notice that our idea here, by the way, is just that rental rate is equal to an interest rate plus that depreciation. And then we can add in from the previous, and we get the household interest rate plus the essentially liquidity friction, FT. Again, FT represents how easy it is to sort of borrow money. We'll refer that to liquidity later on in the semester, and then plus depreciation. So you can see if depreciation goes up, rental rate goes up. If frictions go up, rental rate goes up. If the household interest rate goes up, then the rental rate goes up. Okay, so all of this sort of moves into what we're working towards, which is that we want to have a simple and ultimately graphical representation of the macroeconomy. And so now we can put down a labor demand function. The labor demand function is going to come from the firms, and the amount of labor that firms are going to demand is going to be, relative to the wage rate. So the higher the wage rate, the less labor demand we will tend to have. The higher that productivity measure before, the greater the amount of employees that I will want to hire, and then also the amount of capital. If I hire more capital, if I buy more capital, then the amount of labor that I want to employ is also going to go up because I'm going to need folks to actually utilize that additional capital that I just purchased. So, increase in productivity, increase in capital is going to cause the labor demand to shift out. This is important because, for example, despite the fact that there is no interest rate with respect to labor decisions, we know that the labor demand is going to relate to those decisions because labor demand relates to capital. And so the interest rate affects how much the firms end up having in terms of capital. And so that's how interest rates end up through that channel, end up affecting labor demand as well. And that'll be an important point that we come back to repeatedly throughout the semester. All right. Investment demand, as I was just mentioning to you, this is going to be a negative function of the household interest rate, a positive function of future productivity gains, a negative function of those financial frictions, and then, interestingly enough, negative function of capital, so the current capital stock. So, in other words, again, we're sort of thinking about these ideas so that later on we can put them into a relatively simple and graphical representation of the economic system. And so investment demand in this particular model comes from these particular factors. And so we can ask ourselves what would cause investment demand to shift out. And so if investment shifts out, then that would require RT to go down. That would require AT plus 1 to go up, or FT to go down, or KT to go down. Right? All of these behaviors would cause this outward shift of the demand curve. So the idea here is to start getting an idea of when things like interest rate change, financial frictions change, what is the mechanism that affects firm decisions? And the mechanism here is that it affects firm decisions through investment demand, right? And then also, as we previously said, some of that is going to flow over and it's going to affect labor demand as well. We really start to see the interconnectedness of the economic system. All right, and then just to sort of wrap up this particular conversation, let's bring in that household again. So very similar to what we've had before. The only difference now is that we're going to add into the household's utility function, we're going to add in a choice of how much labor versus leisure that they should have. And so, like I said before, the idea is that individuals supply labor, and the amount of labor that they supply is going to be a function of various things. One of the things that's going to affect how much labor supply someone gives is their preferences, right? So it's similar to consumption. Some of this is sort of nuanced and subtle because it's based upon individual preferences that are at times kind of hard for us to sort of always generalize. But again, the idea is that we generally believe that consumers, or workers, I should say, choose how much to work based upon preferences related to leisure, based upon preferences related to wages, right? If someone really, really likes money, they're probably going to work more hours and less leisure. If someone really doesn't care about money, but they really like spending time with their family, they might choose more leisure than labor. So the math looks complicated, but the concept here is super straightforward. We have, in a sense, sort of a similar set of budget constraints than we had before. The difference here, you'll notice, though, is that this is how much money the worker makes. So the consumption plus savings can't be any bigger than how much money they make, and then plus the dividend. Okay, how much money they make plus that dividend that we were talking about before. And then the second constraint basically just says that consumption in the future time period can't be any more than the wages you're going to get in the future time period, the dividend, any capital gains that you get from that dividend as well, and then interest payments on savings. So you start to see how all of these various factors, interest rates show up multiple places, right? Interest rates are going to affect consumption through savings. Interest rates are going to affect consumption through dividends, right? Interest rates are going to affect consumption through wages and the amount of labor that is employed, right? So you can see that we're coming to a point where instead of isolating the consumption market and the production market, we're going to put these into the single market that they actually are. We do some first order conditions. We look at our Euler equation, simple as before. This is just the same thing as before. It's only complicated by there being more variables in the model. It's not really kind of any difficult. So we get these sort of consumption decisions. Some of these should look very similar. So we get, if we sort of make some simplifying assumptions, we get the exact same consumption function that we got previously. So that's comforting to us. We should feel very comfortable with this consumption function. And then we can add in government spending to this. And so now with a Ricardian equivalence, that is, right? Notice here we say with Ricardian equivalence. So if we assume Ricardian equivalence in our model, then again, remember the idea of Ricardian equivalence is that changes in fiscal policy do not affect consumption decisions. And so what this ends up sort of meaning is that you get these sort of canceling out. But at the very least, we can still see what government spending is at least hypothetically going to do to consumption with no change in YT, right? That's sort of the idea here. And again, notice we still get this negative interest rate. All right. And so to sort of wrap up this conversation, now let's carry this idea over into the actual labor supply. So again, how much labor there is in the economic system is going to be based upon utility maximization. Now, what complicates this, especially when it comes to the labor market, is that it's very hard for us to really parse out income and substitution effects because the nature of wages, and for example, like if there's an increase in wages, it may not necessarily be the case that a firm will decide to fire people because the firm may not be able to fire anybody. So it may be the case that if the firm fired anybody, they would actually not be able to produce anything. So the sort of income and substitution effects as it relates to the sort of worker side is very sort of difficult to kind of understand. The other complication here is that if I make a higher wage, I may decide to work less. If I make a lower wage, I may decide to work more. And so that complicates that income and substitution effect. And then, of course, there's non-labor income, right? Again, this is one of the more important conversations that we have right now in the U.S. economy, is that so much of the wealth that's generated, so much of the income that is generated in our economic system does not necessarily come from labor wages. And so an economy in which a lot of the sort of gains that people are making year over year that are not necessarily coming from the labor supply, then in a sense that we have a hard time modeling that with the basic classical and neoclassical models. That would require a sort of a different set of more complex models. And then lastly, excuse me, I skipped one here. So as I said, labor supply can actually be quite complicated. We're going to kind of ignore most of these complications again, just stuff to sort of keep in the back of our mind. You'll notice in my classes that I discuss more things than I actually ask you questions about in terms of problem sets and quizzes and stuff. I want my class to, in some sense, be bigger than just the material that we're covering. So that's why, keep in the back of your head. Labor markets are very complex. We actually don't necessarily feel great about applying simple supply and demand theory to labor markets. So that's certainly one complication. Okay. And so what this all ends up meaning simply is that the amount of labor that is being supplied is going to be a positive function of wage. So if wages are higher, people are going to tend to be more willing to offer themselves to the market. It's just like prices in terms of production. If prices go up, firms want to produce more. So the simple argument is that higher wages constitute higher quantity supply of labor. But again, some of this is nuanced. And then the idea here is just that we have this exogenous sort of theta, and the theta shows up because there's just going to be sort of some non labor market factor that's going to affect labor supply. Okay. And so we will ignore most of the other complications, but we will allow there to be this sort of theta t, and the theta t shows up here. So we have the intertemporal utility function based on consumption, and the one minus the amount of labor hours that I offer, and so we can see that theta basically ends up representing a preference towards labor hours. Is essentially, I think, a way to think about that. All right. And then to sort of wrap up our particular conversation, let's put this all together into a nice little neat model. You'll notice that when we get to the neoclassical model tomorrow, you'll notice there's a lot of carryover from this. So we're, in a sense, kind of setting up the neoclassical model in many ways. We're not going to worry too much about banks for now. We're going to get to banks a little bit later, especially when we start talking about monetary policy. But suffice it to say that the way that we sort of tend to think about it is, again, that the savings that are generated from a lack of consumption from consumers is going to, in the economic system, end up being equal to loans. Okay. And the reason why that is because the dividend ultimately that the household earns for their ownership over the company ends up being this positive function of investment, but a negative function of interest relative to saving, right? Because the more you're saving, the less you're spending. If you're spending less, then firms are going to be producing less, right? So higher savings causes dividends to fall. So again, this is where we start to get this balance, right? We start to get this balance. Households want firms to invest. Households also seek stability through savings. Okay. Now, how does this ultimately all work out? Market clearing. So market clearing requires that savings equals investment. What that means is that funds taken in by the financial intermediary has to exactly equal that which is distributed to firms for capital investment. So what that means is that output, YT, is just equal to consumption in time period T plus investment in time period T. And then if we want to add in government spending, we just add in that GT as well. So when we talk about the macroeconomy, when we talk about output, aggregate output, we're going to think about aggregate output in the economic system being equal to aggregate consumption plus aggregate investment plus, plus aggregate, in a sense, it's not aggregate, but plus government spending. Okay. And then the equilibrium condition, right? So interest rates are going to be going up and down and moving to equilibrate the economic system, right? Moving to equilibrate the economic system. So if we think about this, for example, in terms of what we're going to call the loanable funds market, so we have loanable fund demand, and then we have loanable fund supply. And the equilibrium ends up being that real interest rate. And then here ends up being just the total amount of loans in the economic system. So we can see that, for example, if savings is less than, if demand is less than supply, then we expect interest rates to decline as we move towards equilibrium. Now, why is that, right? Well, the reason why interest rates would need to decline is because we have in a sense, surplus of loans. We have a lot more loans at this interest rate. Let's call this R, we'll call this R1, R0. So at this higher interest rate, there is a lot more supply of loans than there is demand for loans. And so we expect to move towards equilibrium by the interest rate falling. If the interest rate instead, is here, now we have a shortage of loans. And so again, our expectation is that the economy is going to move towards that. Now, beyond just the loanable funds market, this then translates over into the entire macroeconomic system. Because again, the idea is going to be the loanable funds market ends up being where we get capital purchases, where we get capital investment from. And so later on, when we argue that the production function looks like this, as we did before, right? As we did before, capital and labor, then you can see how the loanable funds market is part of the equilibrium in the macroeconomy, because it creates equilibriums in capital markets, right? Just like in the labor market, created equilibriums in the labor market. So we can sort of see that on both sides, on the consumption side as well as on the producer side, there are these market clearing mechanisms which are pushing us towards equilibrium. And the key equilibrium of the classical, neoclassical, and even to some extent, most of the models that we're going to talk about this semester is that savings equals investment, that the amount of funds generated by people saving money is going to be the amount of money we have available to lend out to firms. Now, what's really interesting is that when we open up the economic system, right, everything we're doing right now is assuming a closed economy. There's no trade yet at this point. One of the things we'll find out is that when you open the economy up, this dynamic gets really, really interesting and starts to explain, in some sense, why our trade flows are the way that they are. All right. And then so what we have is just equilibrium conditions. You have consumption, labor, both in terms of supply and demand, investment, output, and then so all of these have to simultaneously be in equilibrium. for the economy as a whole to be in equilibrium. We have these endogenous factors. These are factors which are determined by the models. And then we have these exogenous factors, and these are factors which are determined outside of these particular models. And then just to kind of wrap everything up, I know this video is getting way too long. Just to sort of wrap everything up, this gets us to what we refer to as a competitive equilibrium. This is going to be really important tomorrow when we start talking about Pareto improvements, or I should say Pareto frontiers, and we sort of start having somewhat of a conversation about efficiency. And so the idea here is that basically markets clear if we make certain assumptions about them. Okay, one of the main assumptions that we make that sort of seems to create market clearing is competitive markets. If the markets that make up our economic system are competitive, the more likely it is that markets will clear. Okay. Now, the other area where we sort of ask ourselves, do markets clear, ends up being in that labor market. And that ends up being one of the more interesting conversations that we have when we get to the conversation about unemployment, because there are frictions in the labor market that at times will cause those labor markets to not necessarily clear, or at least not necessarily clear in the short run. And so what you can have in your macroeconomy, and you can have a lack of market clearing in the short run, and with the sort of expectation that over the long run, the market is going to clear in some way. And when we say market clearing, what we really just mean is that the equilibrium conditions that exist in our economic system are eventually going to be met. And the key equilibrium condition that is going to arise from the competitive equilibrium in the neoclassical model is going to be savings is equal to investment. So again, that's something that we're going to carry with us through the remainder of the semester.